find it a little warm, so I'm gonna take off my jacket here, but I'll stop there. So we need something beyond the technical rationality at times. And what has been identified as reflective practice is an effort to try to address that we do face as technical professionals complex and unpredictable situations that are, again, poorly constrained, poorly defined at times, and we need a more reflective practice. And for myself, I find it embodied by these questions by Rudyard Kipling, where you're really asking the questions that are trying to address the problems that you're trying to attack. It's the asking of the questions that often leads you down the appropriate path. Spolton Delderfeld described it in more detail, descriptions of what we mean by reflective practice. It is questioning, as like those questions on the previous slide, that we don't just listen to what our manager suggests. I think for those of you, there's a couple of you that were in the class yesterday where we were talking about this, and we had an exercise, and I was asking, well, why didn't you ask? What is the appropriate question? And we kind of dutifully went back into the standard engineering approach of you were asked a question and you answered it, not asking, why, what am I really trying to answer? What am I really trying to solve? And why should I do it? A reflective practice does push you to ask why a lot more. Does expect an individual to take authority over their actions. You can't blame, well, the manager told me to do it, for example. Contesting challenges in the workplace that you don't think are appropriately addressing the right problems. And it requires someone to not just design and plan, which is kind of a typical engineering effort, to act, not just to do that, which is typical, but to actually sit back and observe and listen, reflect, and then revise the plan and the action. And I'm just as bad as anybody else. I always say the other members of the team, the first one that they have to actually train in reflective practice is myself. So our goal in this effort is driven by the hypothesis that graduate education in engineering tends to produce competent technicians, but they don't necessarily they have not embodied reflective practice. That we often are taught through a series of homework problems, which have well-constrained, well-defined problems and well-defined answers, but not asking the really big questions, which are the most difficult. Therefore, as a result of that, we're concerned that new engineers, newly minted engineers, may not have awareness of and an understanding and an ability to work in that swampy, well-loved land. So we feel that engineers should, in fact, be reflective thinkers if they're going to actually try to address societal problems and not just solve homework problems. And recognizing the world is uncertain and, again, poorly defined, poorly constrained. So that is our goal, our thesis, that indeed we should be developing an approach that helps us do that. And we were lucky enough to receive a National Science Foundation grant from the Innovations in Graduate Education program to help develop these concepts. So when we think of reflective practice, again, I'm an academic, I don't do anything. We don't actually teach engineers to do anything, but we do, hopefully, can build in them the concepts of reflective thinking, which will be a foundation for reflective practice as they move forward in their career. And again, looking at the literature as to what we mean by reflective thinking is the same concepts. Once again, there's always a useful tool of, if you want an audience to understand what you're saying, you tell them once, and then you told them what you told them, and then you told them what you told them one more time. And so, again, it's the problems that are not well posed, that can't be solved with absolute certainty, that can't be solved with complete adherence to textual rationality that we're trying to develop within the student engineers. So again, combined with understanding of those problems, taking responsibility for them, and again, recognize how poorly constrained some of them are. I would say that we often as engineers think of ourselves as tools. Tell me what problem I can solve. And again, the concept here is more about what are the problems that I need to solve and try to address those more directly. When I look at current engineering practice, some things that require perhaps more reflective thinking than we've given it in the past. When we look into the future and climate change, we're going to be balancing how we're going to avoid the risks of climate change, but at the same time recognize that we're not going to be able to avoid it completely, and we have to adapt. And the balance of those two, as I see, is the great challenge for engineering in the next 50 to 100 years, maybe the next 10 years. There's also some classic problems that are in the news as of today, things like preschool vaccinations, where the technical among us, I think we'd all suggest that vaccinations are a great idea. Why are we even having this argument? People are just crazy to be having this argument, I think, is our general sense as scientists or engineers. But the reality is that we're faced with the real problem is that there is a significant group of individuals out there that don't necessarily see it as a positive thing, or they don't see the cost-benefit analysis weighed as heavily on one side as the other. And so we can sit as engineers and scientists and complain about those people that don't really know anything, or we can figure out how to address it. Certainly a swampy lowland problem. Contaminated sites is closer to the work that I do, and it fits within this as well, in that in reality, if you were going to look at the risks, what are your risks of dying from a contaminated site or contaminated groundwater relative to driving a car on the road? Well, if we were looking strictly at risk and quantitative assessment of risk, we probably would be putting all of our funds into trying to control accidents in cars and other similar sorts of things. Very few people have ever actually had severe challenges, certainly some, but a very, very small number by comparison have actually faced risks from contaminated sites or, say, death from contaminated sites. A surprisingly small number. But if you look at the perceptions of risk, the public perception would probably put contaminated sites as a much bigger issue than car accidents, both because of their lack of confidence or the lack of the ability to control cars, not necessarily the contaminated site. And again, if you're a risk manager, do you sit and complain about the fact that the public's perception is misdirected, or do you try to manage that and address it? You see that all the time in environmental products. You've got a product that is particularly useful, perhaps the original one that started a lot of the environmental concerns were DDT. Extremely important in terms of eliminating malaria, but rapidly also recognized as an extreme environmental risk. It takes a reflective engineer to really be able to contribute to helping make those decisions of how do we balance those costs and trade-offs. There's some more recent ones in the news. Flint, Michigan we all know about that water crisis. That hits especially close to home because my department trains engineers in water treatment and distribution systems. And I see it as clearly a failure of my own discipline, environmental science and engineering. It's unclear whether it was because of criminal, and there are certainly charges associated with it, or incompetence, or just neglect intelligence. It really is unclear, but it does hit close to home. And again, my manager told me to do it doesn't really work very well in trying to address those problems. The Volkswagen diesel emission scandal I find really intriguing because it's one of the few times where I've seen documentation where engineers have sent notes to their managers saying that, well, if we're going to follow the law, we can't do this. You know, a clear paper trail that, okay, we'll do it anyway, but a clear recognition that they were crossing the line. You know, it's usually a lot more subtle and more difficult to, more challenging to an individual. They may not necessarily see as clearly. They may point out all the details, but they clearly recognized in this case that things that they were doing were illegal and yet proceeded down that path anyway. And then the one that's in the news this week, of course, the Boeing MAX 8, and I think it's still going to be settling out over time. But I could easily see an engineer writing the software. Well, if they use it properly, they're not going to have any problem. I once wrote some software as a graduate student to select songs for a top 40 radio station. I was making a little money on the side when I was at Caltech. And so a group of us wrote this. It's a very simple software because the top 40 radio station didn't want to have the same song at 4 p.m. on 2 consecutive days, and you know, a set of rules. Well, I got this emergency call in the afternoon that the software had gone down and we don't know what song to play next. Well, you can go back to your old system. But I realized that in their program manager put in a bunch of different songs and he was saving time, so he didn't actually enter all the traits that they needed. You know, the style, et cetera, that were things that were being examined by the program. He didn't enter all those. Well, on the one hand, I could take the technical rationality approach and say, well, that was foolish. He should have never done that. He should have entered all those entries that I expected him to. Or I should have recognized that they're going to find a way to mess it up, and I should check for these errors. So Boeing MAX 8 could very well fit into that same vein. I could see the software engineer saying, well, if they do it right, there's no problem. But apparently, as humans, we don't necessarily always do it right. And unfortunately, a reflective engineer, or fortunately, a reflective engineer should be able to address that. So what do we do in this effort? DREAM is developing reflective engineers, hoping to develop reflective engineers through artful methods. And that involves explicit involvement of the arts and humanities. It fits in very well with the developing concept of STEAM as opposed to just STEM. You know, arts and humanities is becoming increasingly important and recognized as increasingly important. So we happen to be in the right place at the right time, I guess, with the NSF proposal in at the right time. It's always important, I used to always say this about National Academies reports. A National Academy report, of which I've served on a number of them, they're really helpful if they're right at the correct stage in time. If you're kind of preceding the developing thinking on a particular topic, nobody pays attention to Academy report. If you've already, you know, basically the thinking is already matured, and then you come out with an Academy report, it's also useful. But you have to be like the surfer and catch the wave, and then you can actually have some impact. And hopefully we're in the right place with DREAM. Some of the things that we do with DREAM to incorporate art and humanities is visual thinking strategies, and I'm sure that the faculty that I work with on this would say at the outset, this seems to have really captured my attention. You know, it's the hook that really got me involved in this effort, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But it's a variety of things that have been commonly used in developing reflective engineers in the past and in other related sort of courses like developing or discussing moral dilemmas, writing about oneself to try to develop a better sense of oneself, self-reflection. So a variety of things, but none of those things do we normally use in an engineering course, and that's what makes it intriguing and different. When we first tried to teach a course in this area, we used this as a basic approach. We've modified it somewhat in right now, basically the NSF project is exploring various approaches and see what can work best. But in our first approach, we would try to do a visual thinking strategy exercise, and then there would be some sort of formal presentation, maybe an outside speaker, some discussion, and again, discussion is not something that we often do in engineering courses, but of course, pretty critically important to this. And then some writing. Writing, again, not something that we do with as much regularity in engineering as you might in the humanities, but that also part of the course. Well, VTS is one that, again, captured my attention. It was a real hook for me. What is VTS? It is basically looking at some visual art and discussing it and trying to bring discussion out from individuals about that. We started with having a trained facilitator, and I guess we're still fit into that mode, but of course we're putting everybody into place. Like if I was a facilitator, you would not be able to call me a trained facilitator for VTS. But again, we'll show some examples. Where I first saw it was associated with medical schools. And the concept was VTS is a way discussing and exploring art and trying to look at the ambiguity of art was a way of getting doctors to avoid jumping to the initial diagnosis. Think about the patient, understand a little better before you jump to a diagnosis. Take those extra time. And in a way, that's what VTS does. It's just attempting to force you to explore and think and try to understand nuances that might not be present at first glance, and that's what it really does a great job of. So these are some of the things that have been identified as VTS is successful. Enhances listening and communication skills, critical and creative thinking are the things that I have focused on in particular. It might even make you more respective of aesthetics and art. And again, that's one of those things that requires a lot of effort to bring me up to speed. Remember, I'm the technically rational person, trained in technical rationality. For our project, what we're trying to ask is specifically relative to VTS is how is this changing the students that are going through a VTS exercise? And again, we'll talk in just a minute about what a VTS exercise is for those that haven't seen one. And then how do we, again, we're looking to change an engineering student's perceptions. So what is VTS as an example? And this is one that we've used a number of times. It's a Chippewa family by David Bradley. And there's a lot going on in this figure and this image. And what we attempt to do is basically ask the question. The trained facilitator's role is to ask the question, what is going on in the picture, and then try to prompt to explore, to get the students, the participants, to explore what's happening in a lot more detail. And the more you look at this particular image, which is one of the reasons that we use it a great deal, you see more and more. And you're often left asking, what does the fox have to do with this? Or what does various other aspects have to do with this? There's an awful lot going on in this image. And our discussion often comes around as to, what do you think these people are thinking? Or what are they, where are they in life? There's actually long discussions that we try to bring out of students as they look at an image like this. And the more that they try to explore it, the better, hopefully, they would be able to think more deeply about some of their engineering work. That, of course, is the hypothesis at this point, as yet not completely tested. Yes?
Just a quick question. Was that image made particularly for this exercise, or is this a painting?
No, this is a painting that has been used for this exercise, but you're right, the fact that it has so much going on that are ambiguous, and the ambiguity is so important to this. There is no right answer or wrong answer. quite honestly, it's very interesting to me the way the thought processes of some of the participants have gone as to, well, what is one of these individuals thinking? They often put it into their own lives, and perhaps they think of, this is my grandmother telling me to not do something, not shoot that bow and arrow, again, they develop it a great deal. There's a lot going on in that image, and it was not prepared for BTS. But we'll make use of it. Another one that we've used a lot, which I find interesting because it's more of in the middle between, say, what we would often go to see in a museum and a technical piece. This is a piece, Vernon Fisher, Fort Worth artist, and it also is presented various ways. Sometimes, I think in the actual display in Fort Worth Museum, there's not this spelling across the bottom. I'm still trying to figure out whether Vernon Fisher did this to title it that way or whether that was added somewhere else. I assume Vernon Fisher had to. But you can find it with and without that. I find this almost making it not very useful for ETS because it's kind of putting it right out there. It reduces some of the ambiguity. Vernon Fisher, maybe that's the reason he put this on the bottom of it, at least in some images, because he clearly, I think, wanted to make a statement about the human destruction of the earth. And in particular, there's some hints in here that relates it to nuclear. There's even the locations where the man is cutting the globe have to do with major battles in World War II, which I think is not random. But the whole idea is it's actually modeled after cutting a pumpkin, and it's humans cutting up the earth. But again, we try not to be, not to lead to that level of detail, but simply just ask for participants to identify what they're thinking about as they look through an image like this. Now, one of the things that I want to do, and for the few of you that are in our current class, this is something that I was thinking of doing yesterday, but you'll see it sometime soon, is that I want to take an image that is of engineering concern and try to see if we can bring VTS into our actual processes in environmental engineering. So what I have here is a facility. It's a creosoting facility. It's a picture of a creosoting facility that was taken in the 1960s. And you might be faced as an environmental engineer with, how do I assess the potential contamination issues at a site like this? And you might use historical photograph like this to try to get you clues as to what you should look for and where. And there's a few things that, again, what we try to do in VTS, and I won't go in much detail since I want to try to say it, to get some of those of you that are in this class to look at this more closely yourself. But we might ask questions like the ones on the left over there, looking for things like, are there visible pollution sources? And there certainly are. I'll give some of the easy ones, of course. It's always interesting that the ground around those tanks that contain creosote are just as black as the tanks themselves. This is a pressure treating system, and it looks like there's a lot on the ground there. These are all hints that might help you. What am I going to look for, and where am I going to look for it? And there's actually a wealth of information in that photograph dealing with the river and the interaction with the river that, again, may assist an engineer in deciding and evaluating where they're going to identify contamination, and ultimately use visualization to try and describe what's happening. This is what we would call a conceptual model of that site as to where the contamination is, how it got there, and based upon, first of all, hints from a photograph like that or other information that often is visual, because there's usually records from a 1950s, 60s plant are not existent. It's interesting that in a lot of my work relative to contaminated sites like this, we use Sanborn maps, which are actually insurance maps that were drawn up at early stages that are just effectively a picture, usually hand-drawn, of a picture of what the site looked like. And again, oh, here's a tank. That tank's no longer here. Did it leak? And you look for some of these challenges. Sometimes that's all the information that you have. And I think it's perhaps a simple example of where you could use VTS pretty directly, using a picture and trying to infer a lot of understanding on the basis of just the picture image. Or ultimately then again, drawing an image for other people to show what you've learned. So, I'd like to spend the last few minutes of my discussion as to where are we relative to the success or failure of the experimental exercise. And so we're trying to see, after placing or after using some of these exercises like VTS that I focused on, how we can see any responses in the student. And so one of the things that has been very useful for me, I'm a quantitative person, remember, is to look at pre-surveys and post-surveys. There's a lot of survey-like questions that have been used to explore particular responses in students. And we could hopefully see change over the course of exercises such as this. Not any one exercise, unfortunately, but usually over a sequence of them. But also, we're exploring, especially with the help of Jeong-Hee, to look at more qualitatively, how do we understand how thinking is changing, or how students might express themselves differently. And there's a variety of both quantitative tools you can evaluate that, but also qualitative approaches. And that's why we're a collaboration between psychology, education, as well as engineering, because we need the guidance on how to explore some of these that are not within our engineering background and experience. So this is just an illustration from our first effort. It was a preliminary course, just a 1-hour course, involved a small number of students. And we ask and this is the quantitative surveys, looking at verified surveys that ask each of these questions, things like contextual competence, variety of things that we think make up a reflective engineer. There have been studies of the individual tests that evaluate these factors, and there's been verification of those. We just applied all of them and trying to see differences. So this is a kind of the a box and whisker plot of the pre-test, and then this is a post-test. There's a few things that changed. Interestingly, I thought that the box is getting smaller. We haven't analyzed that, but the fact that a lot of the boxes, the spread among the students seemed to decrease is an interesting aspect. But one of the problems that we had with the initial efforts, and even our current effort, is that we're using environmental engineers, kind of a self-selected group of people that are probably more reflective than, say, I'll pick on chemical engineers. I'm a chemical engineer by training. So if you wanted to work in a chemical plant, you may be a little less reflective than your typical environmental engineer. I remember looking at applications for graduate school. I taught in the chemical engineering department most of my career, and the applications for graduate school would always have essays that I want my career to be this way, I want it to reflect this, and I think by going to graduate school at your institution, it'll help me. The environmental engineers, when I first joined University of Texas, I joined an environmental engineering department, and the essays were all about, I'm going to save the world, and I think you can help. A completely different approach to things. So again, we're dealing with a somewhat self-selected group of probably more reflective people, which is probably why all these boxes are up near the top. But what did we see? There was really only one very significant change over the course of the semester of some of these exercises. And it was a verified scale of what's called contextual competence. And the ability to anticipate, understand constraints and impacts of social, cultural, environmental, political, and other contexts of environmental engineering solutions, not environmental necessarily. That does sum up, I think, quite clearly the sort of changes that we'd like to see that isn't a reflective engineer. And it was actually quite a distinct change over the course of a series of exercises. These are the set of questions that were used to assess that, and again, Rowe et al. Actually have verified this as a measure of contextual competence. That is the only thing that we found that was significantly different. Some of the others, we had individual components of some verified scales, like a scale on self-reflection and insight. Well, there were appeared to be some at least modest improvements in the insight portion of that, not necessarily a fully verified scale. And so this is trying to it's probably a level of gradation that isn't necessarily appropriate, but it's a preliminary effort. We're trying to identify where might be some changes that we can explore more later. And so in these cases, these were all at a 80% significant level, individual aspects of the full scales, not the full scale themselves. And so again, it's looking for, are there hints of changes? All of these are positive changes in the direction of improving more reflective engineering, as the way we've defined it. But again, at this point, all of these are just hints, and that's where the NSF project comes into play. But we do think that there were enough hints there, hints of success, and including a contextual competence improvement, that led us to write the NSF proposal and led us, I think, led that proposal to be successful. The preliminary data that made it look promising to some of the reviewers. So our goal will be to build on that and try to examine a variety of artful methods. And we've been taking a different tact so far this semester in a 3-hour graduate engineering course. Again, we've got a pretty small group of environmental engineering students at this point, where it's going to be difficult to see changes. We're also doing a variety of things, so it's going to be very difficult for us to say which one is most effective, but we will be trying to build on that and expand on that and expand into other engineering, and potentially other science fields over the course of the next couple of years. With that, let me stop and acknowledge that we first got started with this. In fact, the only way that we could have developed that preliminary data was through a Texas Tech seed grant. That was extremely helpful to be able to start this process and collect the data necessary to have the successful NSF project. And I think that the seed grant was doing exactly what that program was attempting to do, which was to try to bring faculty from across campus together to develop some preliminary data to build a program that could be funded externally. And that is the case. So again, thank you to NSF. Thank you for the participants that have been involved in the course, and certainly to Ryan, John, Jeong-Hee, and Roman, who are working so hard to make this work. Thank you very much. Happy to answer any questions, but we'll only take questions from those that aren't involved in this already. Go ahead.
So yeah, do you see any potential gender differences or any different cultural differences in the way that the VTS is perceived? So for example, with the Indian picture that you had up there, depending on the person's culture, you may have a very different view of things. And then do you have conversations between, say, cross-cultural conversations?
I'd say that we don't have any hard information on that at this point for a couple of reasons. One is it's not a very broad group. You know, we don't have a very diverse group, so certainly could be helped by seeing more diversity. But engineering itself is relatively diverse. We potentially could see gender differences, but I don't think that we have anything that could identify them clearly at this point. I think we will be attempting to try to identify those. this point, I certainly don't have anything that would lead me to see those sort of differences. I will say that we do have some, in VTS exercises, I find it really intriguing, the thought processes that lead certain people to respond certain ways. We're still wondering how how to actually make use of those, but some of them have been very intriguing. Yes?
One of the reasons I'm asking that is because as we, achieve HSI status, it'd be interesting to do VTS with a subset, for example, of Hispanic students to see if there's some sort of a cultural convergence that happens with regard to the.
It would make a lot of sense to do that, and one of the difficulties in engineering in particular, it may be another reason to move beyond into other science fields. There's very small numbers of blacks and Hispanics in graduate engineering, extremely small numbers.
So, yeah, I have a sort of a comment on Dom's comment here about cultural differences and so on, and it would be interesting to see if Hispanics differ from whites or non-Hispanics. I'm wondering if that might not be offensive, and that you shouldn't really ask those questions unless you have some basis for asking those questions. They shouldn't just be ad hoc, like, well, let's see if women differ from men, or Hispanics from whites, or blacks from whites, without some reason to ask that.
Well, when you say ask that, I don't see that this would not be asked of the individuals, but as we look at our body of data, I
Yeah.
think exploring where differences exist to basically provide that basis. Is there anything that should
Yeah.
be explored further?
Well, that's a good point, right? Yeah.
No, I don't think that, we would in any sense try to influence without basis what we're doing right now to give, in any sense, a segregation or a separation, trying to identify that.
Yeah.
But if some of the data, we start seeing some differences like that, now, I guess we'd have to ask, are we, in our efforts to maintain anonymity, are we collecting the information to even see it should it occur? And right now, because of the small numbers of Hispanics, probably not. We probably could begin to see changes in gender, because we do have reasonable numbers by gender. Yes?
So another question along these lines. So you're using visual thinking. So you played Dream at the beginning of this, and there are often oral learners or visual learners or kinesthetic learners. So another possibility might be to explore, instead of visual thinking, oral thinking, because it's really sort of deconstructing a complicated scenario and sort of imagining things, but you can do that orally as well as visually. So I'm wondering if you thought about that.
Yeah, I focused on VTS, but we are trying to explore other approaches, and her name escapes me, an individual in Health Sciences Center is using music as one. She has a similar goals in a graduate course that she teaches, or a series of seminars, and is using music as part of that. And so we've explored that to some extent, but right now, well, certainly I focused on VTS, and I would say more driven that way, but we are trying a variety of approaches to see which one's having a greater impact.
As you said, it's probably more relevant to engineers anyway, doing it visually.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question for Don. Do you have any ideas on how that would work anywhere in STEM?
Well, you have to go back to the reflective nature of this. What is the point of using a visual picture, right?
Yeah.
It's causing you to think more deeply, to focus on, different parts of it, and
Yeah.
construct or deconstruct if it is. And you can do the same thing orally as well. It requires a different skill set.
Like use tapes of scientists talking or something like that?
Music, no, you can do all sorts of things. Yeah. Thank for example. Yeah. So you've got different instruments coming in at different times, you've got different themes that are repeated. Yeah. So, I mean, musicians do it all the time in form and analysis, in fact. So that's essentially a visual form and analysis.
It's just to develop that sensory sensibility.
Right.
And so within STEM,
Yeah.
it should.
It's just a different sense that you're using.
What do you think is the ultimate goal you would like to achieve by doing this kind of exercise for students? You mentioned a little bit earlier that we are kind of trained to kind of think in the box and listen to managers and those kind of things. So do you expect that this would be a helpful tool for the students to be a bit more holistic in their approach in their engineering, more ethical, things like that?
Certainly I would, and I guess the simplest way I would put my goal and a major driver for me, especially since Flint, Michigan hit so close to home, I would hope that no student who has ever been exposed to me in a class would become one of the individuals that led to the downfall of the Flint drinking water system. And it sounds like it would apply to a few other things as well, is that I would hate to see one of my students write in an email saying in Volkswagen that, well, it's going to be illegal, but I guess we could do it, or the equivalent of thereof. So it's I think it's a simple characterization of what my goal would be, is that that's the type of engineer that I would like to train. And I think that we, as engineers, always need to, even for kind of small steps towards this, a greater comfort with uncertainty and the implications of that uncertainty as to conclusions that may not be verified, may not be even accepted in the face of uncertainty. That is kind of hard for us at times. We calculate one way and it's 5, and another way and it's 6. Okay, the 5's better, or maybe the 6 is better in some context. Knowing which one's better, why, and knowing that maybe there's no difference between them would be kind of a simple first step that I would hope every engineer could do. But I would also hope that an engineer would always, again, one student that I would train, would always take responsibility for their action and try to understand the implications of their actions. And that means that you can't just accept somebody's view of the direction that you need to take your work. Oh, that's what he asked me to do, and that's what I gave him. That would not be what I want. Yes?
So on the example between the chemical engineer and the environmental engineer, or the introspection, or I guess reflection. So the way you put that example, I saw them both as reflecting in some way. One was reflecting more on their career and the technical side, and one maybe was more socially conscious. So is there like different magnitude of reflection or different types? Or is one more important than the other?
Well, I would say that that when we think of reflection, that we are, it's inherently an outward looking, and looking at our role in broader society. I mean, fundamentally, engineering is about the solution of societal problems. And so that the person that was reflecting internally was not a reflective engineer in that sense. Our creed of practice is about one, doing no harm, but also ultimately solving societal concerns and issues through our technical skills, not building our career. That's not the way that it's stated in our, our creed, if you will.
Well, I think that's true about the creed. So if I'm in ECE, whatever it is, electrical computer engineering, and I'm designing chips all my life, I have to be ethical, sort of in the Volkswagen scandal kind of thing. But ethics is already covered. You had mentioned sensitivity to societal kind of
not come up directly, although they're for ECU chip designer, where do they, if they're designing software that impacts privacy or exchange of sensitive information, they're all having to make decisions about their role in that. Moving, enabling weapons of mass destruction versus ensuring privacy. But I would admit that there are tasks in engineering that would seem less clearly connected to this than others. Environmental engineering, it's relatively easy to see what a reflective engineer would mean and how, because it basically ends up working with the broader community, broader society in protection of their human and environmental health. And it's a little hard to see that in some engineering. But the reality is most engineers move into middle managers, and there they have much more control over the direction of the work that they're doing, and being more reflective of the implications of that can be very good. Yes?
Just sort of following up on that, do you think this could broaden out to STEM more generally and not just engineering?
Absolutely. I do think that we haven't, in our first efforts, we've focused on the groups that we most know, which is environmental engineering. And we've thought about expanding environmental engineering, but I absolutely see no reason for the things that we would be doing not extending further into particularly science fields. And the collaborations, so for example, what I think is one of the more successful efforts that we did recently is a collaboration with art. And there seems to have been some benefit from art as well as certainly some benefit from our side. But in general, in the STEM fields themselves, absolutely. Yes?
Just following up